My name is Alex Morrison. I'm 30 years old and I come from Cedar Falls, Iowa, a town so small that the closing of the John Deere factory was front-page news for 3 months straight. Growing up in a house where my dad worked double shifts at the meat packing plant and my mom cleaned offices downtown, I learned early that dreams were luxuries we couldn't afford. But somehow, books found their way into my hands anyway. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. By the time I graduated from University of Iowa with a degree in English literature, I was carrying $43,000 in student debt and a head full of stories that demanded to be told. New York City called to me like a siren song, promising literary salons and publishing houses where the next great American novel might be discovered. Reality, however, served me shifts at Murphy's Tavern in Brooklyn where I mixed drinks for hipsters who complain about their trust funds, while I counted tips to make rent on a studio apartment the size of my childhood bedroom's closet. For 3 years, I wrote in stolen moments, during subway rides, on napkins during slow shifts, in the blue glow of my laptop screen at 2 a.m. when exhaustion finally gave way to inspiration. I had 17 rejection letters from agents, each one a small death that I kept in a shoebox under my bed like evidence of my persistent failure. But I kept writing, because what else was there? The alternative was accepting that Cedar Falls was my ceiling, that serving drinks was my destiny. The AWP conference in New York changed everything. I'd saved for months to afford the registration fee, living on ramen and whatever free food I could find at gallery openings. The Jacob Javits Center buzzed with thousands of writers. Published authors, MFA students, literary magazine editors, and dreamers like me who clutched their manuscripts like life preservers. I attended every panel I could, taking notes in a composition notebook I'd stolen from Murphy's office supplies. It was during the Breaking into Literary Fiction panel that I first saw Richard Stone. He commanded the stage with the confidence of someone who belonged there. His silver hair perfectly styled, his charcoal suit impeccable even after a full day of presentations. When he spoke about discovering new voices, about the responsibility of nurturing emerging talent, his voice carried the authority of someone who had shaped careers. The moderator introduced him with a litany of accomplishments. 20 years as senior editor at Meridian Press, discovery of 3 Pulitzer Prize winners, architect of countless bestsellers. After the panel, I lingered near the book signing table, not brave enough to approach, but unable to leave. I watched him interact with the line of hopefuls, noting how he gave each person genuine attention, how he made notes in their books that seemed personal rather than perfunctory. When the crowd thinned, I found myself standing before him with my dog-eared copy of his memoir, The Editor's Eye. "You weren't in line," he observed, looking up with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. "I'm sorry, I fumbled for words, suddenly aware of my thrift store blazer and scuffed shoes. Don't apologize for observation. It's a writer's greatest tool." He smiled, and something in my chest loosened. "What do you write?" "Fiction. Literary fiction. I'm working on a novel about—" "Everyone's working on a novel," he interrupted, but not unkindly. "The question is whether you have something to say that matters, whether you have the discipline to say it well." I told him about my novel, still just a collection of scenes and character sketches at that point, about the story of homecoming and displacement I wanted to tell. He listened with the intensity of someone accustomed to finding diamonds in rough manuscript pages. When I finished, he handed me my card. "Send me your first chapter," he said, "but only if you're serious about this, only if you're willing to do the work." 3 weeks later, sitting in his office overlooking Washington Square Park, I felt like I was glimpsing the literary world I had dreamed of joining. The walls were lined with first editions and signed photographs, Richard with Joan Didion, Richard at a cocktail party with Jonathan Franzen, Richard accepting awards at ceremonies I'd only read about in Publishers Weekly. His assistant brought us coffee in actual china cups, and through the window I could see the autumn light filtering through the trees where so many great writers had walked. "You have something," he said, setting down my printed pages. "Raw, but there's a voice here. Authenticity that can't be taught." He leaned back in his leather chair, studying me. "The question is whether you're willing to develop it properly." Over the following months, our meetings became the highlight of my weeks. Every Tuesday at 3 p.m., I'd take the N train from Brooklyn to his office or meet him at his favorite cafe in Greenwich Village. He'd order his usual black coffee and a blueberry scone while I nursed a single cappuccino and absorbed everything he shared about the publishing world. "The industry has changed," he'd tell me, drawing diagrams on napkins. "It's not enough to write well anymore. You need to understand market forces, demographic trends, what editors are buying 6 months out." He'd name-drop agents and editors, sharing insider gossip that made me feel like I was being initiated into a secret society. But more than the industry knowledge, it was his belief in me that kept me coming back. "You have what most writers lack," he'd say. "You understand the working-class American experience without romanticizing it. That's gold in today's market." He'd lean forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The authenticity in your voice, that's what's going to set you apart from all those MFA graduates writing about their privileged suburban childhoods." He began editing my work with increasing intensity, his red ink bleeding across pages as he shaped my rough prose into something sharper, more focused. "Trust the process," he'd say when I questioned his more dramatic suggestions. "I've been doing this for 20 years. I know what works." By spring, our relationship had evolved beyond the professional. He'd invite me to publishing parties where I'd stand in corners nursing wine and listening to conversations about advances in foreign rights that felt like another language. "This is your world now," he'd whisper, introducing me to literary magazine editors and agents who would smile politely and forget my name immediately. The validation was intoxicating. After years of rejection and silence, here was someone who not only believed in my work, but was actively investing in my success. When he suggested I focus entirely on finishing my novel, offering to cover some of my expenses while I took a leave from Murphy's, I felt like I was finally living the writer's life I had imagined. "You're special, Alex," he told me one evening as we walked to Washington Square Park after another productive editing session. "You have something that can't be manufactured or bought, but timing is everything in this business. We need to strike while the iron's hot." The next 18 months became a blur of caffeine-fueled writing sessions and the gradual erosion of everything else in my life. With Richard's financial support, he called it an investment in emerging talent. I reduced my shifts at Murphy's to weekends only, dedicating my days to crafting what I believed would be my breakthrough novel. The story centered on Danny Kowalski, a Marine veteran returning from 3 tours in Afghanistan to his dying hometown in southern Illinois. It was a story I understood intimately, the clash between the person you become in crisis and the person everyone expects you to remain. The way small towns can feel like graves when you've seen the world burn. Danny struggled with PTSD, with unemployment, with a father who couldn't understand why his son had changed, with a girlfriend who wanted the boy who'd left but couldn't love the man who'd returned. Richard threw himself into the project with an enthusiasm that both thrilled and occasionally unsettled me. Our editing sessions grew longer and more intense. He'd arrive at our meetings with handwritten notes, suggestions for character development, plot restructuring, dialogue refinement. "This scene needs more emotional punch," he'd say, tapping his pen against specific paragraphs. Danny's relationship with his father, that's where the real story lives. That's what will make editors sit up and take notice. His involvement deepened as the months progressed. What started as editorial guidance evolved into collaborative creation. He'd suggest entire scenes, propose dialogue, recommend research sources. "I have a friend who served in Helmand Province," he'd tell me, producing detailed military anecdotes that found their way into Danny's flashbacks. "Use this, make it authentic." By winter, I'd produced nearly 300 pages of what I believed was the best work of my life. The prose was tight, the characters complex, the themes resonant with contemporary American struggles. But as I approached the finish line, Richard's behavior began to shift in ways that set off alarm bells I was too grateful to heed properly. He started asking for digital copies of chapters immediately after I finished them. "I want to share excerpts with some industry contacts, get early buzz going." When I hesitated, worried about premature exposure, he'd wave away my concerns. "Trust me, I know how this works. Early reader enthusiasm is crucial for building publication momentum." Our meetings took on a possessive quality. He'd refer to plot points as our story, character developments as our decision. When I'd suggest alternative directions, he'd become unusually insistent. "We've invested too much into this trajectory to change course now. You need to trust the process we've established." The most troubling change was his fixation on obtaining the complete manuscript. As I neared completion, he pressed harder for full access. "I need to see the complete arc," he insisted during one of our April meetings. "Piecemeal editing isn't sufficient for work of this caliber. I need to present it as a unified vision to my contacts." Against my better judgment, a judgment I'd learned to second-guess under Richard's confident guidance, I agreed to his request. On a rainy Tuesday in May, I handed him a flash drive containing the complete novel, plus a printed manuscript bound with brass fasteners like the submission guidelines I'd studied religiously. "The Weight of Home" by Alex Morrison, he read from the title page, his fingers tracing the words with something that might have been hunger. This is it, Alex. This is your ticket to the literary world you've been dreaming of. The ceremony of that moment felt sacred. Here was my mentor, my guide, my advocate holding 18 months of my life in his hands. The novel represented everything I'd learned about craft, about storytelling, about the American experience I'd lived and observed. It was my voice distilled onto paper, my contribution to the great conversation of contemporary fiction. "I'll need 2 weeks to review it thoroughly," Richard said, locking the manuscript in his desk drawer with dramatic finality. "Then I'll begin making the right calls to the right people. By summer, you could be looking at offers from major publishers." I floated home to Brooklyn that day feeling like my real life was finally beginning. The struggling bartender from Iowa was about to become Alex Morrison, novelist. The rejection letters in my shoebox would become artifacts of a previous, lesser existence. But 2 weeks stretched into 4, then 6. Richard's responses to my anxious emails became increasingly vague. Still working through it. This level of project requires careful consideration. When I'd call his office, his assistant would explain that he was in meetings, traveling, dealing with urgent client matters. Our Tuesday meeting stopped. The cafe in Greenwich Village, once our sacred space of collaboration, became just another overpriced coffee shop where I sat alone, checking my phone for messages that didn't come. By August, my financial situation had become desperate. The weekend shifts at Murphy's barely covered rent, and Richard's support payments had mysteriously ceased. When I finally reached him by phone, his tone carried a distance that chilled me. "These things take time, Alex," he said when I pressed for updates. "Publishing moves slowly. Good news is worth waiting for." But there was something else in his voice, a quality I couldn't identify but that made my stomach tighten with unnamed dread. It was the tone of someone holding a secret, someone who knew something crucial that they weren't sharing. The first real warning came in October, 6 months after I'd surrendered my manuscript. I was browsing Publishers Weekly during my lunch break at Murphy's when a small announcement caught my eye. Meridian Press announces acquisition of new literary fiction from acclaimed editor Richard Stone. The Long Road Home promises to be Stone's most personal and powerful work to date, exploring themes of veteran reintegration and small-town America. My hands shook as I read the description. The themes, the setting, the premise. It was my novel, but it couldn't be. Richard was my mentor, my advocate. There had to be an explanation. I called his office immediately. This time, he took the call. "Richard, I just saw the announcement in Publishers Weekly about your new novel. The description sounds remarkably similar to—" "Alex," he interrupted, and his voice carried a warning I'd never heard before. "Let me stop you right there. Whatever you're thinking, I'd advise caution. The publishing industry is smaller than you realize, and reputation matters more than talent. But the story, the themes, are common literary territory," he said smoothly. "Veteran stories, small-town decay, father-son relationships, these are archetypal American narratives. Any resemblance to work we discussed is purely coincidental." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. People like Richard Stone, respected editors, industry pillars, didn't steal manuscripts from struggling writers. It was too obvious, too brazen, too impossible. But deep in my chest, a cold certainty was growing. I knew my story, knew every sentence, every character arc, every thematic thread I'd woven through those pages. And I knew that what Publishers Weekly had described was my work, my vision, my 18 months of bleeding onto paper. 3 weeks later, I stood in the Barnes & Noble in Union Square, holding a hardcover copy of The Long Road Home by Richard Stone. My hands trembled as I opened to the first page and began to read words I had written in my Brooklyn apartment, sentences I had crafted during sleepless nights fueled by desperation and dreams. It was my novel, every word of it. My protagonist Danny Kowalski had become David Kowalski. His hometown had moved from Illinois to Indiana, but everything else, the dialogue, the internal monologue, the carefully constructed plot progression was identical. Even the phrases I'd been most proud of, the moments of prose I'd polished until they sang, were preserved exactly as I'd written them. I bought the book with shaking hands and carried it home like evidence of my own murder. Page after page confirmed what I already knew but couldn't accept. Richard Stone had stolen my life's work and published it as his own. The dedication page read, "To all the young writers who have trusted me with their dreams." I vomited in my kitchen sink and didn't stop shaking for 3 hours.
The confrontation I'd been dreading came the next morning. I called Richard's office at 9 a.m. sharp, my hand still shaking from the previous night's discovery. His assistant tried to deflect me. Mr. Stone is in meetings all morning, but I pressed until she reluctantly put me through. Alex. His voice was carefully modulated, professional. Congratulations are in order, I hear. My book is getting wonderful early reviews. Your book? The words came out strangled. Richard, I need to know what happened to my manuscript, the one I gave you 6 months ago. A pause that lasted forever. Then, I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a fact. I read your book last night. It's my novel. Word for word. You changed Danny to David, Illinois to Indiana, but everything else, every scene, every piece of dialogue, every metaphor, I spent months perfecting. It's all there. Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice carried a tone I'd never heard before. Cold. Calculating. Alex, I'm going to give you some free advice. Be very careful about the accusations you make. The publishing industry runs on relationships and reputation. False claims of plagiarism can destroy a career before it starts. False claims? My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. Richard, I have drafts on my computer, timestamps, email conversations where we discuss specific scenes. Email conversations where we discussed general literary themes. Common narrative territories that any number of writers might explore. The veteran's return, small-town decay. These aren't original concepts, Alex. I felt the ground shifting beneath me. But the specific details, the dialogue... Look, I understand you're disappointed. Young writers often overestimate the originality of their work. It's natural to see similarities where none exist, especially when you're struggling to find your own voice. The patronizing tone hit me like a physical blow. This was the same man who'd praised my authentic voice just months earlier. Richard, you know this is my work. You know it. What I know, his voice turned sharp, is that I have a 20-year career and relationships throughout this industry that I've built on integrity and professionalism. What I know is that you have no proof of authorship for whatever work you think you've created. No copyright registration, no publication history, no witnesses to your alleged writing process. No witnesses? You were my witness. You edited every chapter. I provided general guidance to a struggling young writer, as I've done for hundreds of others. That's not the same as collaboration, and it certainly doesn't constitute evidence of authorship. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but the outcome was clear from the beginning. Richard had positioned himself perfectly, the established professional against the desperate unknown. When he finally hung up, after warning me again about reckless accusations, I sat in my tiny apartment staring at the phone, understanding for the first time the true dimensions of what had happened to me. It wasn't just theft, it was the perfect theft, executed by someone who understood exactly how to leave no fingerprints. I spent the following week in a fog of disbelief and rage. I called every lawyer I could find who offered free consultations, only to hear the same devastating assessment. Without documentation proving I'd written the work before Richard, without witnesses or copyright registration or publication history, I had no legal standing. Intellectual property law, they explained with barely concealed impatience, required proof, not just accusations. Even if everything you're telling me is true, said Janet Martinez, the third attorney I consulted, proving it in court would be nearly impossible. Your word against an established editor with a 20-year track record? And the financial cost of litigation would be hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm sorry, but this case isn't winnable. The Authors Guild was equally discouraging. The representative I spoke with was sympathetic but clear. Without documented evidence of prior authorship, there's nothing we can do. This is exactly why we always advise writers to register their work with the Copyright Office before sharing it with anyone. My friends' reactions ranged from uncomfortable silence to outright disbelief. Jake, my closest friend from college, listened to my story with growing skepticism. "Dude, I know you're upset about not getting published, but accusing Richard Stone of plagiarism? The guy's a legend. Maybe you both just came up with similar ideas." "Jake, it's not similar. It's identical. I can quote entire passages." "Look, Alex, I've read your stuff. It's good, but it's not like you invented the concept of PTSD or small-town stories. Maybe you should focus on writing something new instead of obsessing over this." Even Sarah, the other writer from Murphy's who'd always encouraged my work, seemed to doubt me. "Are you sure you're remembering your own work correctly?" she asked carefully. "Sometimes when we're disappointed, our memory can play tricks on us." The isolation was crushing. Here I was trying to explain the theft of my life's work, and everyone around me was suggesting I was either lying or delusional. The only person who could corroborate my story, Richard himself, was not just denying it, but wielding his reputation like a weapon against me. I began to doubt my own memory. Had I really written those scenes? Were the phrases I remember crafting actually my own, or had Richard suggested them during our editing sessions? The gaslighting was so complete, so professionally executed, that I found myself questioning the very foundation of my identity as a writer. The lowest point came when I tried to access my old drafts on my computer, hoping to find some time-stamped evidence of my authorship. But the laptop I'd written on had crashed the previous winter, and I'd been too broke to recover the hard drive. The backup files I thought I'd saved to a cloud service had somehow been corrupted. Even my physical notes, the handwritten pages I'd scribbled during late-night inspiration, had been thrown away during a desperate apartment cleaning when I thought I was moving to a cheaper place. It was as if the universe had conspired to erase every trace of my creative process, leaving me with nothing but my word against Richard Stone's established credibility. 3 weeks after my confrontation with Richard, I was forced to take on additional shifts at Murphy's just to make rent. The literary life I'd briefly glimpsed felt like a cruel hallucination. I was back to being exactly what I'd been before I met Richard, a nobody from Iowa serving drinks to people who had the luxury of pursuing their dreams. The final devastation came in the form of a certified letter from Richard's attorney, a cease and desist order warning me against making defamatory statements about Mr. Stone or his work. The legal language was dense and intimidating, but the message was clear. Continue pursuing this and we'll destroy you completely. I sat in my tiny apartment that night holding the legal threat in my hands and understood that Richard Stone hadn't just stolen my novel, he'd stolen my entire future, my sense of self, my belief that talent and hard work mattered in a world where connections and reputation trumped everything else. But somewhere in that darkness, something else began to grow. Not hope, I was too broken for hope, but something harder and more dangerous, a cold, calculating anger that burned clean and bright. Richard Stone had taught me something valuable about how the literary world really worked. Now I was going to use that education in ways he'd never intended.
The true magnitude of my humiliation revealed itself gradually. Like a slow-motion car crash I was forced to witness from the driver's seat. The long road home didn't just find readers, it found acclaim. By January, Richard's stolen masterpiece had climbed to number 7 on the New York Times bestseller list, its success powered by what critics called Stone's most authentic and emotionally resonant work to date. I watched it all happen from behind Murphy's bar, mixing drinks for customers who discussed the book like it was a cultural phenomenon. "Have you read the new Richard Stone?" they'd ask each other, voices animated with literary enthusiasm. "It's devastating, so real. You can tell he really understands what these veterans go through." Each conversation was a knife twist. These were my insights about trauma and homecoming, my understanding of how war changes a person, my carefully observed details about small-town dynamics and family dysfunction. But now they belong to Richard Stone, praised as evidence of his deep empathy and authentic voice. The media tour was the worst part. Richard appeared on NPR's Fresh Air with Terry Gross, discussing the personal journey that had led him to write about veteran experiences. "I spent months researching, interviewing real soldiers," he told her, his voice carrying just the right note of humble dedication. "It was important to me to get their stories right, to honor their sacrifice through authentic storytelling." I listened to that interview while cleaning glasses at Murphy's, my hands shaking with rage. Those weren't his research methods, they were mine. The interviews he referenced were conversations I'd had with my cousin Mike, who'd served 2 tours in Iraq. The authentic details he discussed were observations from my own working-class childhood, insights born from growing up in communities that sent their children to war because they had no other options. When Richard appeared on The Tonight Show, I made the mistake of watching. Jimmy Fallon praised the book's emotional depth, while Richard basked in applause, discussing his breakthrough work with practiced humility. "Sometimes a story just comes to you," he told the audience. "This one felt like it was writing itself." I threw up in Murphy's bathroom after that interview, overwhelmed by the casual way he'd claimed my creative process as his own inspiration. Desperate for justice, I reached out to every literary organization I could find. The response was always the same polite dismissal. "Without documentation proving prior authorship, we can't investigate claims of plagiarism. These are serious accusations that require serious evidence." I tried contacting book bloggers and literary journalists, thinking that someone in the industry would be willing to investigate such a brazen theft. But Richard Stone's reputation preceded him everywhere. "He's been a respected figure in publishing for decades," one editor told me. "You're asking me to believe he'd risk everything to steal from an unknown writer? That's not how this industry works." But that was exactly how this industry worked, I was learning. It worked through relationships and reputations, through the careful cultivation of credibility that made someone like Richard untouchable, while someone like me remained invisible. The legal consultations continued to be devastating. Every attorney I spoke with delivered the same verdict. Without proof, I had no case. "Even if everything you're saying is true," one lawyer explained, "proving it would require resources you don't have and evidence that doesn't exist. Richard Stone could tie you up in court for years, bankrupt you with legal fees, and then sue you for defamation. You'd lose everything." My personal relationships crumbled under the weight of my obsession with the theft. Friends grew tired of hearing about it. Family members back in Iowa suggested I was having some kind of breakdown. "Maybe you should see someone," my mother said during one of our increasingly strained phone calls. "This conspiracy theory isn't healthy, honey." The breaking point came in March, at a book reading Richard was giving at the Barnes & Noble in Union Square. I hadn't planned to attend. Some masochistic impulse drew me there, like returning to the scene of an accident. I sat in the back row, wearing a baseball cap and trying to make myself invisible. Richard read from Chapter 12, the scene where David Kowalski confronts his father about the family's financial struggles. I had written those words during a particularly difficult night, drawing on painful memories of my dad's layoffs and my mother's quiet desperation. The passage had taken me weeks to perfect, balancing the raw emotion with literary restraint. Hearing Richard deliver my words to an appreciative audience was like watching my own autopsy. But worse was the Q&A session that followed. "The father-son relationship in your novel is so authentic," said a middle-aged woman in the third row. "Did you draw on personal experience for those scenes?" Richard smiled with practiced warmth. "Writing is always autobiographical in some sense," he replied. "Those scenes came from a deep place. I've been estranged from my own father for years, and writing David's story helped me understand some of my own family dynamics." The lie was so smooth, so confident, that for a moment I almost believed it myself. But I knew the truth. Those scenes were based on my relationship with my father, my family struggles, my understanding of how economic pressure fractures working-class families. Richard was taking credit not just for my work, but for my life experiences. During the book signing afterward, I watched person after person tell Richard how much his story had moved them, how authentic and powerful his voice was. Each compliment felt like another theft. He wasn't just stealing credit for my work, but for the emotional truth I'd poured into it. As I walked home through the cold March night, something crystallized in my mind. I had been approaching this all wrong. I'd been trying to prove that Richard had stolen from me,
trying to reclaim something that was already lost. But what if instead of looking backwards, I looked forwards? What if instead of trying to expose Richard's theft, I simply proved my own talent so definitively that the truth became undeniable? The idea that had been growing in the dark corners of my mind finally took shape. Richard Stone had taught me something valuable about the literary world: that reputation was everything, that credibility trumped merit, and that the right connections could make mediocre work successful, while great work by unknown writers went ignored. But he'd also shown me his weakness. His success with The Long Road Home was built on stolen foundation. He wasn't actually the genius everyone believed him to be. He was a fraud who got lucky with one spectacular theft. I, on the other hand, was the real creator. I had the talent he'd stolen, the authentic voice he'd claimed, the genuine insights he'd packaged as his own. If I could channel my rage and pain into something even better than what he'd stolen, if I could create work so undeniably brilliant that it demanded attention, the plan began forming as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. Not revenge in the conventional sense, not exposure or confrontation or legal battles I couldn't win. Instead, something more poetic. I would write my way out of this nightmare. I would create something so powerful, so clearly superior to Richard's stolen work, that the literary world would have no choice but to recognize the real talent. And in that recognition, the truth about The Long Road Home would become obvious. Not through accusation or proof, but through the simple demonstration that Richard Stone was incapable of producing work of that caliber on his own. For the first time in months, I felt something besides rage and despair. I felt purpose. Richard Stone had stolen my past, but he couldn't steal my future. That belonged to me, and I was going to claim it in the most devastating way possible, by being everything he could never be. A real writer, an authentic voice, a talent that couldn't be faked or stolen. The war was just beginning, and this time I would be fighting on my own terms.
The reckoning came not with fanfare, but with whispers. 2 years after Fractured Ground won the National Book Award, the literary community began connecting dots that had always been there, waiting for someone with credibility to trace them. It started with a review in the Paris Review. Professor Margaret Chan, the same critic who'd praised my authentic voice, wrote a retrospective piece comparing Richard Stone's body of work before and after The Long Road Home. Her analysis was surgical in its precision. The stylistic departure in Stone's 2018 novel is so dramatic as to suggest either an unprecedented artistic evolution or the influence of an uncredited collaborator. The voice that emerges in The Long Road Home, raw, working class, authentically American, bears no resemblance to the polished, somewhat derivative prose of Stone's earlier works. Other critics began to notice. A piece in The New Yorker examined the curious parallels between Stone's breakthrough novel and my award-winning work. Morrison's Fractured Ground wrote James Patterson, not the best-selling author but the respected literary journalist, reads like the work of someone who has lived through betrayal and emerged with hard-won wisdom about authenticity versus artifice. There's an unmistakable maturity in his handling of themes that Stone explored with similar insight just 2 years earlier. One wonders about the creative ecosystem that produced two such remarkably similar visions. The speculation might have remained academic if not for Thomas Brewster, a former editorial assistant at Meridian Press, who'd left the company after a dispute with management. In a long Twitter thread that went viral, he revealed what he'd witnessed during the production of The Long Road Home. "I was tasked with editing the early drafts," Brewster wrote. Stone seemed unusually unfamiliar with his own work. He couldn't answer basic questions about character motivations or plot development. When I suggested changes to improve flow, he became defensive in ways that seemed odd for someone who'd supposedly lived with these characters for months. Most telling, he had no earlier drafts to show me, no research notes, no character development materials. For a book supposedly drawn from deep personal experience, there was no paper trail of creative development. The thread gained thousands of retweets within hours.
Other publishing industry insiders began sharing their own observations. Copy editors mentioned Stone's inability to discuss his character's psychological development. Marketing people noted his vague responses when pressed for personal anecdotes to use in promotional materials. The dam broke when Maria Santos, a fact-checker at Publishers Weekly, revealed that she'd been contacted by Stone's legal team 3 years earlier and threatened with a lawsuit for asking too many questions about the novel's research methods. They warned me that irresponsible journalism could damage Mr. Stone's reputation, she wrote in a Medium post that quickly gained national attention. I backed off then, but Morrison's success makes me wonder what story I failed to pursue. Within a week, #Stonegate was trending on Twitter. The literary community, which had initially protected Richard through silence and skepticism, now turned on him with the same fervor. The Authors Guild announced an investigation. PEN America issued a statement about the importance of protecting emerging writers from exploitation. Richard's response was predictably defensive. He released a statement through his attorney denying baseless allegations from disgruntled industry personnel and attention-seeking critics. But the damage was beyond legal repair. When pressed by increasingly aggressive journalists, his explanations became contradictory and desperate. The breaking point came during a live interview on NPR's Fresh Air, ironically the same show where he'd initially promoted the stolen novel. Terry Gross, armed with detailed analysis from literary scholars, asked him to explain specific stylistic choices in The Long Road Home. The dialect in Chapter 7, she said, reflects a very particular regional voice, specifically rural Iowa vernacular. Your biographical materials indicate you grew up in suburban Connecticut. Can you talk about how you developed that authentic voice? The pause stretched for nearly 10 seconds, an eternity in radio time. When Richard finally spoke, his voice carried the hollow tone of defeat. I worked with research assistants, conducted extensive interviews. But the voice isn't just researched dialect, it's lived experience. The way poverty shapes speech patterns, the generational trauma embedded in working-class communication, this reads like memoir disguised as fiction. Another long pause, then barely audible. Sometimes a story comes from places you don't expect. The interview effectively ended Richard Stone's career. Within days, Meridian Press announced they were reviewing their relationship with Mr. Stone in light of recent allegations. The review was brief. By the end of the month, they'd terminated his contract and pulled The Long Road Home from circulation. The Authors Guild expelled him after a 2-week investigation. The evidence, once people started looking for it, was overwhelming. Former colleagues came forward with testimony about Richard's inability to discuss the book's creative process. Editorial notes revealed his confusion about basic plot points. Most damaging were email exchanges between Richard and Meridian's marketing department, where he'd repeatedly deflected requests for personal background information to support the book's promotional campaign. The final blow came from an unexpected source. My cousin Mike, the veteran whose stories had inspired much of the original novel, read about the controversy in Stars and Stripes. He contacted a journalist to confirm that he'd shared his experiences with me, not with Richard Stone, during family gatherings in Iowa. Alex was the only writer who ever talked to me about the war, Mike told the Washington Post. He understood what it was like coming home to a place that hadn't changed while you'd been broken and rebuilt. I never met this Stone guy, never talked to him. Alex earned those stories through family and understanding, not research. Richard's confession, when it came, was as calculated as everything else he'd done. His lawyer arranged for him to plead guilty to copyright infringement in a closed hearing, avoiding the spectacle of a public trial. The statement he released was brief and lawyerly. I acknowledge that portions of The Long Road Home were based on materials provided by other sources without proper attribution. I deeply regret this error of judgment.
Even in confession, he couldn't bring himself to name me or acknowledge the full extent of what he'd stolen. The literary world's response was swift and merciless. Richard was blacklisted from every major publishing house. His speaking engagements were canceled. The university, where he'd been teaching a masterclass in literary editing, quietly removed him from their faculty. Within 6 months, the man who'd once been a respected industry figure had become a cautionary tale. As for me, vindication brought unexpected challenges alongside the satisfaction. My publisher, Knopf, offered me a 3-book deal worth $1.2 million. Fractured Ground was optioned for film adaptation. I was invited to speak at the same literary conferences where I'd once been invisible. But success also brought responsibility. I established the Morrison Foundation for Emerging Writers, funded by my book earnings and dedicated to supporting working-class writers who lacked the connections and resources to navigate the publishing industry. We provided grants, mentorship programs, and, most importantly, legal resources to protect against the kind of exploitation I'd experienced. I accepted a position as visiting professor at Columbia's MFA program, teaching a course called Authenticity and Voice in Contemporary Fiction. My first lecture always began the same way. The most important thing I can teach you isn't about plot structure or character development. It's about protecting your work and yourself in an industry that will exploit your talent if you let it. The students, young, eager, trusting in the same way I'd once been, listened with the intensity of people learning survival skills. I taught them about copyright registration, about the importance of keeping detailed records of their creative process, about recognizing manipulation disguised as mentorship. But I also taught them about resilience, about the way authentic voices ultimately rise above manufactured ones, about how the work itself, honest, lived, and earned, becomes its own form of justice. My relationship with mentorship had been transformed by experience. When young writers approached me now, I was careful to maintain clear boundaries. I offered guidance without taking ownership, encouragement without creating dependency. I'd learned the difference between supporting someone's growth and shaping them for your own benefit. Richard Stone had taught me that lesson in the cruelest possible way, but it was a lesson I was determined to pass forward in its positive form. Real mentorship, I discovered, was about helping writers find their own voices, not stealing them. 5 years after the theft, 10 years after meeting Richard at that conference, I sat in my office at Columbia, looking out at the same Washington Square Park where he'd once walked me through his vision of literary success. But the view looked different now, clearer, more honest, earned rather than promised. A knock at my office door interrupted my reflection. A young woman entered, Maria, a first-generation college student from Texas whose short stories showed remarkable promise, but who seemed perpetually uncertain about her place in the literary world. "Professor Morrison," she said, clutching a manuscript, "I was wondering if you could look at my novel draft, but I want you to know I've registered it with the Copyright Office and I've kept detailed notes about my creative process." I smiled, recognizing the defensive posture of someone who'd learned caution too early. "That's smart thinking, Maria. But before we talk about your manuscript, tell me about your story. Not the plot, the real story. Why does this need to be written? What truth are you trying to tell?" As she began to speak, her voice gaining confidence with each sentence, I understood something Richard Stone had never grasped. Real literary success isn't about taking someone else's authenticity. It's about creating the conditions where authentic voices can emerge and flourish. The greatest revenge, I'd learned, wasn't destroying your enemy. It was becoming so genuinely successful that their fraudulent achievements looked pathetic in comparison, and then using that success to make sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else. That was justice. That was redemption. That was the story worth telling.